Okay, about tonight. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Bill Adams, who will be speaking about dirty secrets of the oil industry in Canada. During the 1970s, Dr. Adams was a research scientist with Environment Canada, conducting Arctic research on oil spill impacts. Then he was a senior defense scientist at the Department of National Defense until 1986. He was the founder and director of the Electrochemical Science and Technology Center, University of Ottawa, from 1986 to 1985. From 1995, he was president of the first spin-off company from the University of Ottawa. Dr. Adams is currently vice president strategic planning at Resco. That was formed in 2010. As an experiment this week, or this month, we're trying something new. We pre-recorded the lecture and connected with Dr. Adams, who's now in Toronto. So he's going to be watching the presentation with us, and then he's available live for question and answers right after the presentation. Because it's new, we may come through a few glitches. There's a lot to coordinate, and once again, Jan Johns and Mel Turner are helping us out with that. But if there's a glitch, please be patient, and we'll try to polish out a better version the next time we have this occasion. That's all I have to say for now until the end of the talk. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Bill Adams.
Am I live now and people can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think the plan will be to use the pre-recorded presentation, and Jan is in charge of that. So she's going to share screen, and we will learn about dirty secrets of the oil industry in Canada, a historical perspective of oil response in Canada. And I noticed some of my buddies who have worked on the oil response issues at Resco, and I'll be talking a little bit about that, and they're part of the audience. So I'm happy to see that. So I think, Jan, you can start things moving.
Hello to the virtual audience, and thanks to the Almont Lecture Series organizers for their invitation for me to present this talk. I have attended this series for many years, and I'm very pleased to be a speaker. I'm going to start the talk.
The committee will come to order. This is a historic hearing. For the first time, top fossil fuel executives are testifying together before Congress under oath about the industry's role in causing climate change and their efforts to cover it up. For far too long, big oil has escaped accountability for its central role in bringing our planet to the brink of a climate catastrophe. That ends today. Big oil has known the truth about climate change for decades. In the 1970s and 80s, Exxon's own scientists privately told top executives that burning fossil fuel was changing the global climate. Exxon and other big oil companies had the opportunity to tell the truth and lead the way to find alternative energy sources. But instead, big oil doubled down on fossil fuels. Working with the American Petroleum Institute and the Chamber of Commerce and other front groups and PR firms, the industry ran a coordinated campaign to mislead the public, hide the dangers of its own product, and derail global efforts to reduce greenhouse emissions. At the same time, they were lining their own pockets. Between 1990 and 2019, the four oil companies here today reported nearly $2 trillion in profits. But the cost of inaction on climate have been far higher. The American people lost more than 30 years when we could have curbed climate change. Today we face stronger hurricanes, dangerous wildfires, and destructive floods. As the efforts of climate change have become undeniable, big oil has changed its record and its rhetoric. Now they say they believe in climate change and they support the Paris Agreement and a price on carbon. They promise they will reduce their carbon emissions and even aspire to net zero emissions. And they've spent billions of dollars on PR firms to paint themselves as climate champions. But big oil's actions tell a different story. These companies not only continue to sell millions of barrels of oil every day, they are also investing in new oil fields. Their lobbying also tells a different story. Today, the committee is releasing a new staff analysis showing that over the past 10 years, these 4 companies have dedicated nearly only a very tiny fraction of their immense lobbying resources to enact the policies they publicly claim are key to address climate change, while spending tens of millions to protect their profits from oil and gas. Earlier this year, a senior lobbyist at Exxon admitted the truth. He was caught on video saying that Exxon's support for a carbon tax was merely a, quote, talking point, which would never become reality. And even today, lobbyists from American Petroleum Institute and other industry groups are fighting tooth and nail against key climate provisions in the Build Back Better Act. But we must act. Just this week, the United Nations released a new report stating that nations' current climate pledges fall far short of what is necessary to avert catastrophe. These experts agree that we will still have a narrow and fast disappearing window to prevent the worst outcomes from climate change. To do that, we need to immediately cut fossil fuel emissions by 3 to 4% each year and rapidly transition to net zero carbon emissions.
At COP26, we heard Greta Thunberg speak passionately about her views on government inaction regarding climate change. It appears that the oil industry is quite afraid of this teenager and her views, view her as a threat. A Canadian company stoked a major controversy after an image of a pornographic sticker emerged showing Greta being sexually assaulted with the company's logo superimposed on the sticker. Not very nice. So, is the title Dirty Secrets of the Oil Industry in Canada justified? Well, I would say the evidence is beginning to look like it probably is. Now, I've thought a lot about the topics that could be discussed in terms of the Canadian oil industry, and here are a few that could be discussed. First of all, there's a danger to the industry because of the renewable competition based on the economic argument, and divestment is occurring as well because people sometimes find a better return by investing in wind energy than in the fossil industry, as well as the environmental impacts on climate and ecosystems. For example, Nigeria, terrible situation, and the oil sands in Canada, probably pretty bad too. We could talk about the example of spill response by the industry. In the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, in the very heart of the oil industry, there was a blowout, and it was a very serious situation. How would Canada respond to a blowout on the East Coast, for example? Then there are the coastal communities in Canada, many Indigenous. They're seeking a significant role to participate in the protection of their local fishing and aquaculture and are worried about the impacts of oil spills. An example of the Hatsik in BC near Bella Bella. There are also a large number of what are called orphan wells, that is abandoned wells after they've become non-economic throughout Canada. And they're to be cleaned up, of course, by public tax dollars. And then there's the Government of Canada's response to the oil industry and the growing pressure from movements like Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenage activist, to make real changes rather than hollow goal setting, as many think have been occurring at meetings like COP26 in Glasgow. The oil spill response system in Canada is regulated by the federal government. It provides regulations under which the oil industry-owned corporations operate to respond to oil spills. Worldwide, the oil industry has created oil company-owned entities such as Oil Spill Response Corporation, based in England, that includes almost all the world's major oil companies, tanker fleet owners, pipeline, and other oil-related companies. This organization offers its members oil spill response capability anytime and any place. They offer training and support as well as hosting scientific meetings and workshops. In other words, the oil industry controls the agenda of the oil response system throughout the world. With regard to current funding related to oil spill response in Canada, the program is highly influenced by the oil industry. It favors technologies that use chemical spill agents to disperse the oil slicks. The industry actually owns the chemical companies making the dispersants. They also favor the use of in-situ burning of oil spills and do not support the development of improved systems to collect spilled oil, and are funding extensive research at Canadian universities on the topic of natural biodegradation of oil spills by oil-eating bacteria already present in the ecosystem, including work in the Canadian Arctic. Often the research is excellent, and I have monitored papers coming out of the work that's being done in Canada. It's good work. But the impact on the Canadian oil spill programs is, I think, questionable. Tonight, for full disclosure, I plan to present some information on the oil spill response and the views of a small company called Resco, of which I am one of the founders. Resco is a Canadian corporation, federally incorporated, has conducted in-house research on oil spill response technology and the ISO standards work associated with Arctic oil spill response since 2010. For additional information about Resco, you can look at our website, Resco, restco.ca, Resco. As background, I want to provide a short historical sketch of the Canadian oil industry to provide some context for this presentation that follows related to oil spill response in Canada. Now, the oil industry in Canada, although it started in the mid-1800s in Ontario, about the same time as the industry in the US started, the earliest wells and companies were in Ontario, which still produces some crude oil. Note that a cubic meter is about 8 barrels. The impact of this oil industry is actually still happening, as an explosion caused by an abandoned well in southwestern Ontario this year, which destroyed the downtown of a small community in southwest Ontario, it happened this year. So this problem is not restricted to Western Canada. Now, as the slide indicates, the number of abandoned wells in Ontario itself is over 6,000, and those in out west are at least 160,000 and probably more. And you can see that even in the current century, we're still producing some oil here in Ontario. So the conventional oil out west was discovered and began to be drilled and produced around the time of the First World War. However, it wasn't until after the Second World War that the industry really began serious growth, and that was when the Leduc field was exploited, and it wasn't until 1967 when the first oil sand production began with the Great Canadian Oil Sand Project, which is now called Suncor. I, in fact, worked for Imperial Oil at their research center in Sarnia when I was a student in the late 50s, early 60s on an oil sand related research project. So you can see the The slide here shows what the oil sands currently look like, and you can see the extent of that program. It's a huge program because there's a lot of oil present in these oil sands. Now, what is the situation with regard to Canadian production? Well, this slide gives you an idea. By 2020, Canada is now thought to have the third largest oil reserves in the world, is the fourth or fifth largest oil producer, about 5 million barrels per day, and the fourth largest oil exporter. You can see the role of Alberta is pretty large. It's larger than many countries, even larger than Norway, which is often thought of as a major oil producer. There are many ways to approach this topic. I have chosen to discuss how we approach oil spills in Canada to illustrate my thesis about the industry. This is a subject about which I have personal knowledge dating back to my experience as a research scientist working for Environment Canada in the 1970s, when the industry was preparing for the development of Canadian Arctic oil reserves with an active program of exploratory drilling taking place throughout the Canadian Arctic. It was decided to undertake a major program funded by a combination of industry and government to gain more understanding of the impacts that such developments would have on the Arctic. The experimental oil spill that I participated in was the largest test spill ever undertaken, and the program still stands out as a unique source of data based on the breadth of scientific investigations that were part of this program. There were 46 scientific papers, probably 5,000 or more pages of scientific information, and 5 books were produced. This photo, which is taken from the covers of 2 of the books, there were 5 produced. The left-hand side shows the cover of crude oil in cold water, and it shows the mouth of the Mackenzie River, which of course flows into the Beaufort Sea. The test oil spill that's shown on the right side, which is the book cover for Oil, Ice, and Climate Change. Interesting that they were talking about climate change in the 1970s in this program. It shows that there was a test spill, which is now no longer possible, although a test spill is now being planned for about 100 kilometers offshore from St. John's, Newfoundland, likely in 2022, to study in situ burning of crude oil. These tests that I am going to talk about here were conducted in the Arctic on a bay out of the Beaufort Sea at a place called Cape Parry during the winter of 1976. The circular structures that you can see on the slide are about 100 feet in diameter and consisted of floating booms with curtains hanging down below them that were installed in the open water in the fall so that the heated crude could be pumped under the curtained off areas in January when the ice was about 2 meters thick. It would contain the oil, and that would later be encased in the further growth of the sea ice. We operated from a field camp of tents on the shores of the bay, about 10 kilometers south of the Cape Parry Dew Line station. And we were serviced there by Twin Otter aircraft that were equipped to be able to land on the tundra. My role was related to understanding the impact of the oil on the solar radiation balance and the ecology of the organisms that lived in and under the sea ice, such as the plankton. There was concern that the dark oil on the surface of the sea ice could impact the stability of the Arctic sea ice regime and perhaps impact climate. The oil was burned in the spring as a test of what is called in situ burning as an oil spill response. You can see that if you burn the oil on the ice, it's converted to smoke that spreads out quite widely from the site of the burn. Here you can see the covers of the 5 books that were produced, and these books were very good summaries of the 5,000 pages of scientific work. They were written to be accessible to the general public. You did not have to be a specialist biologist or an oceanographer to understand the gist of the information being transferred through these books. In 2010, I was one of a group of like-minded people that formed the company Remote Energy Security Technologies Collaborative. This is the company RESCO that I've been talking about. I mentioned it earlier. Amongst the RESCO activities has been our concern with the Canadian Arctic and how to make it more energy sustainable. At a parliamentary hearing in Ottawa, which I was asked to provide information on Arctic oil development and the risks from this activity, I mentioned the Beaufort Sea project and the very extensive knowledge that had been gained on oil spills in the Arctic and their impacts. It appeared that over the 30 years since this work was undertaken, government officials present at the hearing had lost track of this program and the information that it had created. I found out later there were only a few locations in the Fisheries and Oceans Canada departmental libraries where the information was being held, other than my own personal holdings. As a consequence, RESCO formally requested permission of the government to scan and post on our RESCO website the 5 summary books that were created from the projects. And you can see the covers on this slide. We also published part of the introduction in Inuktitut, which I think is a relevant thing to have done. As an aside, I worked for several years, about 2015 to 2020, with the International Standards Organization, the ISO, on developing standards related to Arctic offshore oil and gas operations. At one point, the Canadian group working in this program suggested at an international meeting of the ISO that it would be useful to develop ISO standards for Arctic oil spill response. However, this initiative was firmly rejected by the oil industry, and they made it clear in Canada and other countries, such as Norway, that they would not stand for governments to support such an initiative. I believe that such an ISO standard was seen to be a threat to the system that the industry had in place throughout the world, in that it would have instituted independent evaluation of oil spill technologies and systems. Of course, the Canadian government did not approve or supply any financial support for this ISO initiative, and it was abandoned as of early this year. Arctic communities are also at risk from oil spills other than industrial oil development activities, as they depend on oil deliveries for their communities. They require fuel oil and they require diesel and gasoline. In addition, the moratorium on oil developments in the Canadian Arctic is shortly to be revisited and may be lifted, which again would put the Canadian Arctic at risk. So now I would like to discuss how oil spills on our Canadian coasts are handled under this closed industry-controlled system that places priority on creating the impression of world-class capability to clean up spilled oil, in my view. In my opinion, the government regulators have been captured by the industry, making it very difficult to improve the system and to provide optimum protection for the coastal communities that bear the brunt of oil spill impacts, such as those on the west coast of Canada, where shipping operates in dangerous waters and narrow channels. The presentation that follows is based on a white paper from RESCO on the Canadian oil spill response and a talk that I and my RESCO colleagues provided at a U.S. conference on water quality earlier this year, and it discusses a concept that RESCO is promoting to empower coastal communities to play a more significant role in responding to threats such as oil spills to their local waters. This story, I believe, represents a real and powerful example of how the oil spill response system works in Canada and why the existing system needs to be improved. The present plans in place for oil spill response in Canada are based on a system with 4 tiers of response, depending on the size of the spill, starting with the smallest spill in Tier 1 of 150 tons. That is about 1,000 barrels. That's not an insignificant amount of oil. The test spill we did in the Arctic was 600 barrels. The response is provided by organizations regulated and controlled by the oil industry within the Canadian Coast Guard regulation guidelines and Transport Canada's guidelines. Transport Canada has published standards for the oil response organizations that apply to designated ports and enhanced response areas, but not to Canada as a whole. You can see that the Tier 1 is responses necessary to handle a local spill or provide an initial response. Well, that's a 1,000 barrel spill. Could be a 1,000 barrel spill. So I've added, you can see, to the three that are listed, a Tier 0. This would be a new tier that we are advocating for oil spill responses that would be community-based in the coastal regions and organized along the lines of the volunteer fire departments. This slide gives a response time for the existing tiers. So you can see that the Tier 1 response is 6 hours. That would be for 1,000 barrels of oil, a 6-hour response. Well, in 6 hours, oil can travel a long way. And you'll see from one of my modeling slides coming up what this might mean. Although coastal communities are the ones most impacted when the spill occurs, they play almost no role in the response process. Since rapidity of response is a key to success in removing spilled oil and keeping it from contaminating the shallow productive coastal waters, especially not allowing it to reach the shoreline, the need for a rapid response is what has led RESCO to make the case for adding a Tier 0 level of response that would greatly improve existing systems. The proposed improvements would reduce environmental and economic damage to the coastal aquatic systems and provide great savings in the cost of oil spill response and remediation. You can see the oil cleanup costs, as estimated by these authors, increases enormously as the shoreline is impacted. And just to give you an idea what the costs are for large spills, you can see that it reaches into the billions, depending on the worst case and the size of the spill. These would be marine spills of tankers or tankers running aground and spilling. For example, just to give you an idea, the blowout in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico cost BP up to $50 billion. The current oil response system is based on a regional capability that locates the equipment at sites with trained personnel on standby, able to respond in a time frame determined by the distance to the spill, which often means up to a day or more. For large spills or the risks posed by a grounded ship, this makes sense, since the equipment is capable of pumping and storing large volumes of oil, a capability that is essential in a large spill situation. However, what is lacking is the ability of rapid response to begin the cleanup within a short time before the oil begins to spread so widely that it is no longer possible to effectively apply skimming technologies to remove the oil from the environment before it reaches shorelines where damage is most severe and where the costs of removal escalate. It is estimated that the cost per ton to clean up oil from shorelines is about 7 times higher than from the water surface. In the slide can be seen large crews involved in the shoreline cleanup, and that adds to the monetary costs as well as to the cost of the health impacts to the crews working there. Most of the workers involved in the Exxon Valdez cleanup work in 1989, as shown in this slide, are now dead or suffering disabilities from the exposure to the crude. A proposed Tier 0 response dictates when the first responders are to arrive at an oil spill and begin cleanup operations. And we think that that could be within 2 hours of the report of the spill. This rapid response depends on the presence of oil spill equipment being located on the coast close to where the spills might occur, as well as the trained personnel being readily available and local to initiate the response. The implied requirement of implementing a Tier 0 response is that planning must include a significant role for the local coastal communities in the overall structure of oil spill response. It does not take away the need to prepare for very large spills that could occur and would require the regional capabilities of the incumbent Tier 1 to 4 resources already in place on the east and west coasts of Canada. Since most spills are small and usually close to communities related to oil storage or to the delivery of oil, or associated with vessels, sometimes sunk or abandoned along the coast, the Tier 0 response will significantly reduce the impact and costs of oil spill response if added to the existing spill response systems. This issue has been explored, and the following statement from the 2015 Canadian Royal Society report is relevant. The highest relative risk values were for small spills due to their higher frequency of occurrence. The risk of large spills is generally low in Canada. The risk generally increases in nearshore zones compared with deep sea zones, with the exception of the Pacific sector where the U.S. traffic may increase deep sea probabilities. The increase in risk of nearshore zones is related to an increase in environmental sensitivity. Clearly, a different approach is needed, and hopefully one that does not involve the use of chemical dispersants that can remove the oil from the surface, but then it clearly creates environmental impacts, perhaps worse than the oil alone. To implement Tier 0, which is based on coastal communities somewhat like a local fire department, will require the creation of an organization that provides appropriate equipment, ensures the equipment is maintained and kept ready for deployment within 1 or 2 hours of a spill being reported, and sustains the training program for local personnel. Perhaps the most difficult aspect is associated with the human resources related to liability and maintaining community interest and focus, since spills are intermittent occurrences, somewhat like fires. Could the Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary play a role here, similar to how the Department of Defence has engaged Arctic communities in maintaining the security of Arctic Canada by supporting the very successful Canadian Ranger program? The training faces the same training problem faced by centralized response organizations, namely limitations of simulated spills without permission to use oil in the environment. As I mentioned, back in the 70s, we did, and we learned a lot, but that's no longer acceptable, it appears. Canadian Rangers support the military in operations such as search and rescue and community safety. Seen here are members of the Royal Canadian Air Force and several Canadian Rangers evacuating residents of a First Nation community aboard a C-130 Hercules during a support operation. Also shown are 2 Marine rescue volunteers during a Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary training held in the Arctic. The volunteers are among 24 people working with the Canadian Auxiliary in Nunavik. The Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary is made up of 4,000 dedicated volunteers. Members are mainly pleasure craft operators and commercial fishermen who use their own vessels or community-owned vessels for safe boating education and search and rescue related activities. It is proposed that in part the equipment provided for the local communities in a Tier 0 oil spill response would be multi-use rather than totally dedicated to oil spill response, as is the Tier 1 to 4 gear, and therefore not used often except in training or in spill response. To the extent possible, the vessels would be in daily use by members of the community who also had a Tier 0 function, similar to those of a volunteer firefighter or a Canadian Ranger. Other specialized equipment such as booms, bioremediants, and adsorbents could also be sited locally and training provided for their use. The incentives for local participation in Tier 0 would be, other than some compensation related to the use of the multipurpose TZ boat and the work on the spill itself, that those involved are directly protecting their own waters upon which their communities depend for their livelihood from aquaculture, fishing, and tourism, and perhaps most importantly, their cultural and spiritual connection to their coastal waters. This slide sums up the tier 0 spill response. Not only will oil spill response costs be reduced if Tier 0 is added to the existing oil spill response system, but the likelihood of small spills, too small for the response organizations with their Tier 1 of 1,000 barrels, that they could be handled by a TZ boat. Most importantly, because the response is rapid, oil will be prevented from spreading widely and contaminating shorelines and having a large impact on local fisheries and aquafarming, and the resulting claims for compensation that result. In creating such an enhanced spill response system by adding the Tier 0 level, Canadian companies involved in the production, shipping, and storage of oil would achieve lower insurance costs for their operations and improve their image, which would be essential in maintaining social license. It may also obviate the motivation to use dispersants. So, what is the Aboriginal community's view of current oil spill response, and what are their thoughts about their proposed new local roles in this concept? Well, the October 2016 sinking of the Kirby tugboat Nathan E. Stewart in the waters of the Heiltsuk tribe, located on the beautiful west coast of Canada, near Bella Bella, is a sobering example of the failure of our current oil spill response system. Although the sinking was located relatively close to oil spill response facilities, the traditional waters of the tribe were greatly impacted. This Indigenous nation subsequently has worked to improve the spill response system by issuing a number of reports and recommendations that they, the local community, become a key part of the system in future based on local people playing a central role in the earliest stages of a spill incident. Other Canadian agencies and groups, such as the National Collaborating Centre for Environmental Health, have recognized that the Aboriginal peoples of coastal Canada need to play a role in emergency response, especially in oil spills, with regard to planning, response, and recovery. These communities depend on the harvest of fish and shellfish for their daily requirements, as well as for commercial sale, so the contamination of the waters has a dramatic and long-lasting impact on both their health and economic activities. In addition, as expressed by the Heiltsuk group themselves in this case, this is the quote, "The October 13, 2016 Kirby spill exposed holes in Canada's touted world-class oil spill response regime. After the crash, 16 hours passed before official responders arrived on the scene, where Heiltsuk mariners were already hard at work trying to mitigate the worst of the effects of spreading diesel as it seeped into the shoreline aquaculture beds." And in a recent World Wildlife Fund report, non-economic losses that Indigenous communities experience as a result of oil spills are fundamentally different from any other potential claimant, because Indigenous communities have a unique point of view on principles such as governance, stewardship, and community. The rest of this presentation suggests a way to improve this situation based on the implementation of this Tier 0 concept. But of course, the best future would be if hydrocarbon use is greatly reduced. RESCO has spent more than a decade reviewing existing oil spill response regimes and technologies, noting weaknesses and failures. RESCO has also studied innovation in this space and approaches which demonstrate higher degrees of success. RESCO has also developed a protocol for community-based rapid response to oil spills using a novel technology and local resources. Tier 0 response represents a new concept that could include an effective Canadian oil skimming technology implemented in vessels that would be sited along the coastal regions where aquaculture facilities are located, and for which these vessels would be used in normal operations of aquaculture and open water fishing, but could be rapidly deployed in their oil spill response capacity within 2 hours of a spill report. The RESCO 7-meter skimmer multipurpose workboat concept, the TZ boat, as shown in the slide, represents a new approach to how vessels can be designed for coastal oil spill applications and also play a central role in enabling a Tier 0 response from the coastal communities. The key feature is that an effective skimming function is built into the 7-meter boat, which is based on a patented Canadian gravity separation technology. Previous proposed use of this technology focused on much larger vessels for use in offshore regions, although smaller development vessels were built to demonstrate the gravity separation technology, such as the one that will be shown testing in the USA facilities in a later slide. In addition, due to the design of the skimming system, the crew on such a TZ boat are not exposed to the oil being collected, since they can operate from a filtered air in an enclosed helm, which is not the case for most oil spill response systems that involve booms and other mechanical skimming systems. The design of a TZ boat is shown in the slide and is currently being evaluated by Canadian boat builders for an initial production of test prototype vessels prior to production in volume. The exclusive oil-water separation technology is fully scalable, so larger or smaller boats of the 7-meter version described are entirely feasible. A somewhat larger version may be a better fit for coasts where there are no roads, so trailer ability for fast backup is not an issue, and somewhat smaller versions perhaps better suited for inland waterways. This technology provides excellent rates of oil recovery on both calm waters and in waves. The gravity collection system was tested at the U.S. Navy's facility in Omset in New Jersey and proved to have a high collection efficiency even in waves, as shown on the slide. The white structure to the left is the gravity separation tower that is pumped initially so that the water flows up into the tower from the surface of the water between the twin hulls. Then, as the boat encounters floating oil, it rises into the tower to be captured and then pumped into storage when enough oil accumulates in the tower. This is a continuous process as the boat moves through the oil-covered water at about 3 or 4 kilometers per hour, depending on the thickness of the floating oil. It's also a very simple and non-complex system with very few parts other than a pump to make it work. As well as oil spill response, which is infrequent, the primary function of the boat could be harbor patrol, aquaculture, environmental monitoring, removal of harmful algal blooms, shoreline cleanup, buoy tending, or any number of typical workboat functions. This multifunction design means that the community is not facing the expense of a dedicated vessel and crew for a rare event, yet still have a vessel at hand which can respond to a community emergency such as a fuel spill more quickly than remote equipment, which can take days to arrive on scene. If adjacent communities have such boats, they can be quickly trailered by road to supplement the oil spill recovery that is tailored to the size and characteristics of the incident and its location. In addition to the gravity separation system, the boat featuring a ramp can carry personnel and equipment, for example an ATV, to shoreline areas not accessible by road. It can also deliver oil barrier booms to prevent oil from reaching the shoreline and spray bioremediants on the spill area to promote environmental recovery. The presence of the Tier 0 system on Canadian or any coasts would not only provide a rapid response, but one that could be quickly enhanced depending on the scale of the spill by moving these 7-meter vessels by trailer or water to create a swarm capability that could, for example, protect aquaculture facilities from pollutants and protect vulnerable shorelines. This capability would be similar to that of sharing of fire response by the fire services of nearby communities when the situation is beyond the capabilities of the fire station closest to the fire. As autonomous operation of these vessels is becoming possible due to advances in AI-driven capabilities, such as the Sea Machine Robotics Company from Boston, as you can see an example on the left-hand slide, it is envisaged that multiple vessels acting as a swarm, such as aerial drone swarms, now being developed for civilian and military applications. See the image with the concept on the right of the slide. This could be combined to deal with spills very effectively. This approach could also be far more effective than current recovery technology, where achieving oil recovery of more than 10% would be considered a success, and where the remainder of the oil would have been dispersed by natural processes or intentionally dispersed with chemical dispersants, both of which could endanger the ecosystems, including any aquaculture or fishing in the area. The Resco 7-meter skimmer multipurpose workboat concept is based on rapid response. Advantages with regard to reducing biological impact and climate change are described. Shorelines are rich sources of biodiversity. The health of shorelines is threatened by a variety of pollutants, the most devastating of which is oil. Once the shore is contaminated, it is a nightmare to get anywhere near to being restored to a healthy state. And the cleanup process is unhealthy to the workers and very expensive. It is blatantly self-evident that every reasonable measure needs to be taken to ensure that oil is stopped from reaching shorelines. This needs the right tools, materials, and knowledge applied as quickly as possible. The TZ boat is designed to meet these criteria. Resco has also been active in exploring whether oil response technology could contribute to solving the growing plastic pollution problem under a grant from the National Geographic Society, and has explored the use of our skimmer technology for removal of algae, bearing in mind the serious impacts of harmful algal blooms on water quality and the potential for removal of algae to make a contribution to reducing greenhouse gas contributions of methane to climate change. The Tier 0 concept of oil spill response has been shown to offer lower cost and more effective protection of coastal waters from oil pollution, while providing the coastal communities, many of which are indigenous, a key role in keeping with their traditional respect for their lands and waters. A multi-purpose oil skimming workboat has been presented that we hope to play a significant role in oil spill response, as it, according to Resco intentions, is to be produced commercially in the next 2 years. The photos on the next 2 slides show the Resco team working on a prototype of the Tier 0 skimmer, mostly at my house on the Rideau River north of Kemptville, and showing a model of an early prototype on show at a conference in Sept-Îles, Quebec. I would like to thank and acknowledge this team that has worked together for over 12 years on issues of oil spill response and other environmental issues, particularly for remote communities. This photograph series shows on the upper right Chris Ives working on the tower for the gravity separation system. Below that you can see Chris Ives, and the person with the green hat is Peter Russell, the president and CEO of Resco, working on the section of the separation system into which the tower fits, below the pontoons of the vessel that we use for the prototype testing of this system. On the upper left, you can see Daryl McMahon and myself with a model of a early version of the prototype that we took to a conference on industrial harbors in Sept-Îles. These photographs show when we had completed the prototype of the gravity separation system, we installed it in a pontoon boat, and you can see it here being launched and used on the Rideau River near my place north of Kemptville, and we were collecting simulated oil. It turned out to be apples from some trees on my property, and we also used it for collecting algae in these tests. You also note that the people involved with RESCO are all gray-bearded and mostly in their 70s and 80s. The shot showing Peter looking very excited was taken in Quebec, and that again shows the model. In this case, we have a conveyor so that we can collect algae using some of the oil spill type technology. As I mentioned, this is related to some work that was funded by the National Geographic Society to use oil spill response technology for plastics. So some summary thoughts. There is at present no way in Canada that new technology can be compared against existing technology for oil spill response. A lot of research is being done on dispersants and in situ burning and biodegradation in the existing system, while Canadian government accepts that skimmers and booms can't collect more than about 5 or 10% of an oil spill. At present, the certified oil spill organizations, all owned by the oil industry in Canada, don't have their response plans reviewed openly and transparently to ensure that the best technology available is being used by the oil industry to clean up oil spills. Canada needs a process of trying new technology in actual oil spills to do performance comparisons against the existing technology. This is especially critical in the nearshore, where the existing technology is being defeated by fast tidal currents, and which our technology is trying to correct. This is why I covered the Beaufort Sea studies, which did allow for test oil spills in the field, from which many practical lessons could be learned. RESCO would like to acknowledge the Government of Canada for providing scientific research and engineering development funding, and to the naval architect Stephen Leake, a local naval architect in Kemptville, who's providing design support for the TZ boat. So finally, returning to the West Coast, on March 16th, 2021, the Heiltsuk Nation and the Canadian Coast Guard and Transport Canada announced a memorandum of understanding that paves the way to create a Heiltsuk Marine Emergency Response Team and plans for how the team will complement the long-term plans for the response center. This perhaps suggests recognition that a Tier 0 oil spill concept may be emerging in Canada. I would like to acknowledge the courageous response of the Heiltsuk Nation on the west coast of Canada has shown the way forward for all coastal communities throughout the world when faced by the threat to their traditional ways of life by powerful external forces that seem to be uncontrollable, but can be tamed with traditional knowledge, fortitude, combined with science and engineering capabilities. So
this incident has solidified for our community that this is our place to take care of, and we will defend it with everything in our bodies, everything in our hearts and minds.
We have to stop being irresponsible with transporting petroleum products along this coast. And we will hold Canada, British Columbia, and industry accountable. In dealing with the Kirby Corporation, what we experienced was negligence by the company captain and crew, resulting in immediate and unknown future environmental damage to the natural and cultural resources within our Hilftsuk territory. By Canada and British Columbia and their various agents, there was a disorganized and chaotic and ineffective spill response with little to no recovery of the petroleum products that dumped into our territorial waters.
The booms that they deployed took over 12 hours. They weren't the proper type of booms for that kind of weather. They were incorrectly set around the tug and barge and quickly broke apart by the currents.
The recovery of the barge and tugboats took a long time, 30+ days, with weather delays and storms in between, waiting for supplies to come up. If we're talking about protecting what we have here, we have to do better than that.
Articulated tanker barges continue to tramp up and down our coast full of petroleum products, and we will not bear the risks of transporting petroleum products unsafely on our coast any longer.
It's been an emotional day. It is easier when we gather with family and friends and allies.
There's no silver lining to an incident like this, but it is undeniable that what it brought out in the community was incredible strength.
We have to fight for justice for what happened, because our ancestors wouldn't have had it any other way.
The following 3 slides are references to provide some background to my presentation. They will be on the video available from the Almont lecture series website. And are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Bill Adams, for the really informative presentation you gave and the interesting solution that you proposed. So I certainly hope it's successful. You sold me.
Good. Would you like to buy one?
Well, that's another story. Okay, I'd be happy if people have any questions or comments for Bill.
Mel seems to be raising his hand.
Here's Mel.
Yeah,
Yes.
Mel here. Bill, that was a very interesting presentation. Thanks very much. In one of your earlier slides where you were proposing a tier 0 emergency force, a widely distributed emergency force, you mentioned the Coast Guard Auxiliary, I think. Has there been any response from that organization as to interest in that?
There hasn't really been a response from the Coast Guard, other than their lack of interest in putting this gravity separation technology into use. In fact, it's sort of interesting. They paid for building a vessel to test the technology. In fact, you saw it in one of the test tanks down in New Jersey. They then returned it to Canada to a base in the Maritimes. And at one point we requested, could we use this vessel for further testing and development? And we were told, oh no, you can't have it because it's so critical to the Coast Guard for oil spill response. Well, that vessel has been sitting, we're not sure exactly where, but it has never been in the water. So they've basically blocked it entirely. So the powers that be don't seem to be interested in doing anything other than what the oil industry has told them to do, basically, and that is develop methods of responding to oil spills using dispersants, and they're busy stockpiling. I mean, basically thousands of gallons of these dispersants are now being stockpiled on the coasts of Canada, both on the east and west coasts, and that's what they're planning to do. If this is an oil spill, they'll just put the chemical dispersants in to make it disappear. And so what can one? I mean, that's why I ended my summary by saying that in order to make progress, there has to be some kind of way of ensuring that real tests are done, and different technologies of approaching oil spills have to be compared, because that's not happening. Right. And it's not happening. It's not only in Canada where this is the situation. It's the oil industry is so powerful that it's managed to do this throughout the world. Well, at least the Western world. I'm not sure what they're doing in places like China and Russia. Right. So
thanks. That was exactly what I was afraid of.
Dispersants. Oh.
Peter Perry, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I was going to ask. So, if you use dispersants on inshore areas, what's the effect of that on the ecosystem?
Well, where it has been done, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, they used a lot of dispersants there. There's been quite a bit of study of the organisms at different level in the ecosystem, and there's very major disruptions in the spawning, and a lot of the fry they're born with abnormal features, and the people that have to work when their dispersants are being used, like it was widely used in the Gulf of Mexico spill in 2010, there's been a lot of health effects on people subsequently. So it's not good stuff.
Other comments or questions?
There seems to be someone in the chat, but I don't know if it's a question or not.
Just thanking you for an informative presentation.
Oh, okay.
I have one naive question, Bill. I mean, from what you said, it sounds as though it would be to the oil company's advantage to promote your proposal. Where have I gone wrong?
Well, I think that it's a matter of control. The oil industry gets nervous when anybody except the oil industry is in control of what they think are critical elements of their business, and the ability to control the process of oil spill response is an important one from their social perspective. I mean, if they can make the spill disappear quickly, then it looks good, and that's what they seem to want to do. They don't really, I mean, from an insurance perspective, if they could keep the oil from reaching shorelines, you'd think that would save them a lot of money. But you know, BP lost $50 billion and it's still in business. I mean, if you think what the congressional chair of the hearing said, you know, they've made they made $2 trillion. That was profits, not just their income. That was their profits over the last 20 years, well, 30 years, I guess, from 1990 to 2020. I mean, that's an unbelievable amount of money. It dwarfs anything that national governments can deal with. Even the United States can't deal with that. So it's hard to know how to control this industry, and we're in a really tough situation because of climate change. The only thing I can hold hope for is that people like the teenager I showed from Sweden, you know, Greta. I mean, if that movement takes place in the next generation, then maybe things can change. But I mean, I'm a bit discouraged personally.
Yes.
To see changes.
Yeah.
And John Coder, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, it's a question, actually, a couple of short questions. Have you had a chance to evaluate the rate at which your gravity separation apparatus takes oil out of the water? In other words, how many barrels per hour? And is it reusable?
Is the oil yes, the oil comes out at better than 90%, probably better than 90%. So there's very little water in the collected oil, and we can collect oil depending on the thickness, the film thickness. That's what would depend on the rate of collection. So the vessels can collect at something like 3 or 4 kilometers per hour, and if you think of the mouth of the vessel between the pontoons being in the order of a couple of meters, that's quite a few meters to be collected per hour, and you could calculate the amount. So we could, with fairly thin films, we would get barrels for every 8 hour. Barrels of oil could be collected in an 8 hour period, and that's quite important in terms of actually removing it from the water. So yeah, we've done calculations, and there have been practical tests with the work that was done in New Jersey. We haven't been able to work with real oil, as I mentioned. That's against the law. So the only way we've done work in small flumes, our own test tanks. We can do work there with models, with small versions, but we haven't been able to do a full scale test like we were doing with the pontoon boat in the Rideau River. We used apples. We can collect the apples very effectively, actually.
Thank you, John. Anyone else? Any last question or comment?
Just a comment, really. I have to say it was an absolutely fascinating presentation, but also enormously depressing.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Well, don't be too depressed, because I mean, the people that are working in the field are aware that there are problems, and I mean, it's, in Canada we have an individual who is in charge of the research programs, and he won't do anything except work on dispersants and in situ burning. And I find that very frustrating, but I must say that he's a good scientist, and the work that's being done is really good in those two areas. But I just wish that they'd put some effort into some of the other areas that could actually, I think, remove oil from the environment. So
I get the other thing is they're clearly not being forced to address the damage to ecosystems for First Nations communities. If that were valued much more highly, they would be rushing to follow your sort of suggestions.
That's true, and we are talking to First Nation communities on both coasts. We have links to the Mi'kmaq groups in the east, and to some of the other tribal groups on the west coast, and I have some links into some of the Inuit in Nunavut, and those people are very interested in doing things themselves. They want to be more in control themselves. They don't want to be just hired by the oil industry to do something. They want to have an early and significant role to play. So
dispersants and burning, neither of those are good ideas for the environment, right?
quite true. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's why clearly the research program isn't adequately directed. You know? So at the end, the question is, how do you get it?
How do you get it to change? It's been in place for 5 years now. And it started around 2015, and it's going to probably get another lease on life. And they've spent probably $50 million on this research. I mean, some of it is okay. I actually like some of the work that's been done on genomics of oil-eating bacteria that are present in the environment, because that is you can do bioremediation by enhancing the role of these bacteria. In some cases, you know, you really can't do anything except live with the oil. Well, if you could enhance the bacterial action, that would be good for the environment. So
yeah, exactly. I recall just that I'll get things. I recall in Britain, the only way they got safety laws really working for industry, you know, worker safety in you know, machine shops and all the rest of it, was to make the top people criminally liable if they hadn't thoroughly, you know, made sure safety was dealt with. That meant you could go to jail. And I watched senior people really smarten up and really pay attention and really make sure they had good programs in place, because they knew their own liberty was at stake. And that seems to me the only way you make those sorts of things happen.
Could be. It could be. It would certainly help. The other thing in the U.S. at the congressional hearings, I thought it was interesting that the CEOs of these big companies were being lectured at, and hopefully they would respond in some way. I mean, I don't think these people are criminally responsible in a sense. I mean, they're embedded in a culture which is said that growth is the only thing, and to grow we've had to use fossil fuels. I mean, we have to change the whole way of thinking, really.
A couple more people have comments.
Yeah, of course.
Just a couple of quickies. John Codera, and then you're not Jocelyn. I can't see. First, okay, is John still there?
I think perhaps my hand just didn't go down.
Oh, okay.
My question's answered. Thank you.
Okay, your turn.
Bill, did I understand you correctly that if you had a working oil skimmer, you could not take it to an existing oil spill and demonstrate its efficacy?
At the moment, that would probably be true. Yes.
That's terrible, you see, because my sense is that you really need to have some demonstrated ability that is covered in the press in order to shame the rest of the world to show what the alternatives are.
That would be a big help.
and so what I'm suggesting is, what would be the penalty to you if you went and did that and if you brought the press along with you, so that when I'm serious.
I think it would be probably $50,000 or something. The cost of intentionally contaminating the environment is very high, actually, in Canada. So I think they'd throw the book at me if we did that. And as a director of this little company, I don't want to have that happen because we don't have insurance. Okay, so
that's a terrible comment on our world.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Okay, that's wonderful. We'll call to a close there. Bill Adams, I want to thank you very much once more for a fascinating look at another world and good stuff that you're doing.
No, thank you very much for all of the audience that came and listened. So
I also want to thank Jan Johns, Mel Turner, and Glenda Jones for the work they did to prepare this. Jan, go pour yourself a glass of wine.
Jan particularly, she really helped because we had to put this together because of my location. I'm not really on the river ice boating. I'm actually down in Oakville. So
a couple of reminders. If you can spare a few dollars and want to contribute to keep our Zoom sessions going here, please, you're welcome to do so. You can donate small amounts of money by clicking on the word donate just under the waterfall picture in the website, and the website is Almont Lectures, one word, .com. Our next Almont lecture is going to take place on the 28th of January, another Friday evening. And we're having none, of course, on the holiday area. On 28th of January at 7:30, the editor of the Hum, our beloved Hum in town, Chris Riando, who's also very much involved in community theater, is going to talk about the past, present, and future of community theater, particularly in this area. So it should be quite interesting, and I hope you attend. Lastly, I'd like to thank you all very much for attending tonight's lecture. I hope you go away knowing more about the oil spill industry than you did before. It's a good way to learn it. So thanks to all. I wish everybody a good holiday season, and I hope to see you on the 28th of January.
Thanks very much, Warren.
You're most welcome. Bye-bye for now.